Hi, everybody. It's me again. I hope everybody's had some really good food, maybe an extra cup of coffee. We're here on the dreaded post-lunch panel, trying to keep our energy up. The really good news is I've been excited about this panel all week because we have three really seasoned leaders in the elections community in the US here, all of whom know each other and I think hatch schemes together all the time. So we shouldn't have any trouble with energy or with expertise on this panel. So kind of same rituals last time I was up here. I'll quickly introduce everybody and then give each panelist a chance to kind of frame our problem, which is looking at not just voting machines, not just the internet, but how do we kind of holistically think about technology in the context of elections administration in the US, especially at this really important and really fraught moment. So on my right, we have Tammy Patrick, all the way at the end, of the National Association of Elections Officials, where she's the Chief Programs Officer. In the middle, we have Carolina Lopez, who's the Executive Director of the Partnership for Large Election Jurisdictions. And immediately on my right, we have Kim Wyman, who's a Senior Fellow of the Elections Project of the Bipartisan Policy Center and a former Secretary of State of my home state, Washington. So I think, Kim, we decided you go first. Do you mind just kind of giving us a lay of the land? I think part of what distinguishes this panel from the one this morning is you all are really working day in and day out with and between elections commissioners and elections commissions across all the states. What's going on and what's the situation regarding technology in this election?
Well, thank you for having us here today. It's really going to be hopefully a fun conversation. So I come to this work with 30 years of experience, starting at the local level. I started as an election director in Thurston County, Washington, which is up in the Pacific Northwest. And when I started in elections, we were using punch card technology and optical scan where people fill in the oval. And for the first 10 years of my career, I had to become an election expert, like all of you, had to learn all of the mechanics of counting and making sure that everything was done properly and done to law and accurately. And then in 2000, we had a little presidential election that came down to a single state, Florida. And the world started learning about CHADs and started learning about punch cards. And we had, in my state, we had our state determined the fate of the US Senate. So we had not a very close recount, but a recount that definitely got our attention, and we were very, very thankful for Florida because all the lawyers in Florida would have come to Washington. So in 2000, I not only had to become be an election expert, I also had to become a technology expert, an IT expert, because Congress passed the Help America Vote Act, which hopefully you've heard about already, but this was pretty sweeping legislation that gave states the responsibility of having a voter registration list, which had been done at the county level and the local level prior to that. And it also gave an infusion of money to update our systems, because one of the tenets of this law was that punch cards were illegal after a certain date. And lever machines where they would just pull a lever and it didn't actually put anything on paper. It was kind of weird to think about now. And so in the 2000s, really becoming this IT expert was a big part of my job on top of being an election administrator. And then I became the county auditor, which in my state was like the local county clerk that conducted the elections. And we had the 2016 election, excuse me, I'm jumping way far ahead. No, I guess I'm doing well. Somewhere between there, I ran for and became the state's chief election official, the Secretary of State. And so in 2016, some of you may have seen the election we had here in the United States, where suddenly foreign actors were trying to get into counties in the middle of Iowa or the middle of Olympia, Washington, and trying to get into their systems and spreading misinformation and disinformation. So now we also found ourselves having to become cybersecurity experts. How do we secure our infrastructure when we have roughly 8 to 10,000 offices in election offices across the country. And then 2020 happened, and like all of you, we got to navigate running a presidential election. Maybe you didn't have to run a presidential election in COVID, but we did, and it was so fun. Okay, I'm lying, it was awful. But we also had to not only be health experts to a degree, we suddenly had to be communication experts, because we had people who were accusing us of rigging the election. And this was kind of uncharted territory in many ways, even though I know many of us had been through close, high-profile elections. So I guess what I want to do is sort of do a level set. That's sort of the skill set that is needed today in modern elections in the United States, being experts in all 5 areas of any part of an election. And you would think, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the United States system, but we don't have a nationalized election system. I'm sure you all know that. And people assume that the federal government pays for our local elections, particularly when the presidential race or congressional races are on our ballots, and they don't. And so, with the exception of the Help America Vote Act 20 years ago, the federal government really hasn't infused money at the local level in a way that levels the playing field for resources. And I think this is what we're going to get into in this panel. So if you are lucky and you are Dean Logan and you are the registrar in LA County, you have really good resources. You have enough money to do your job. You can hire enough staff people. You can conduct an election for the, 5 million registered voters you have. But if you are Heidi Hunt in Adams County, Washington, with your 10,000 voters, it's up to whether or not your county commissioners give you enough money to fund your election operation. And these are oftentimes local election officials that are either elected or appointed. And so, when I was county auditor, I was competing with the county sheriff for money. So do I get a deputy auditor or do I get a deputy sheriff? I can tell you who won that battle most of the time. So what has happened since 2004, when the Help America Vote Act really changed elections across the country and really infused money into these systems and updated them, is if you're in a well-resourced county like Los Angeles County, you're going to have what you need. But if you're not, you're just, in some cases, holding it together with baling wire and duct tape and hoping nothing goes wrong and no one kind of notices, that you can just kind of slide under the radar. And what we saw and have seen since 2020 is any jurisdiction in the country can become a hotspot overnight. It can be a sleepy little, county with 5,000 voters and suddenly is on the national news because someone forgot or ran a set of ballots through a reader twice. And even though administratively they did everything right to correct the error, the narrative is they were rigging the election. So that's kind of where we are today with, don't wait for it, 1 day, 6 hours, 46 minutes, and 8 seconds left before the first polls close, at least the polls in my state. So I say this because that's the biggest challenge from my vantage point. I now get to look at elections from the national perspective with the Bipartisan Policy Center, which is an organization that really tries to come up with solutions that are bipartisan, that Republican and Democratic points of view are considered in legislation and policy ideas. And so, what we're seeing is really this, as election officials have prepared for this moment, they're ready. I can confidently say that they have been laser focused for 4 years on what's going to happen tomorrow and probably happen until January 20th. They are ready, they have contingency plans. I think the biggest difference now from 4 years ago is the focus on resilience. And I think part of the reason why we had such a successful election in 2020 is we were so focused on cybersecurity and building resilient systems so we could respond and recover to an event that when COVID happened, we just rolled with it and we were able to switch over. Those same officials now, 4 years later, have been laser focused on dealing with people advancing narratives that are simply not true, but have gotten a foothold in the American psyche, and they're ready. It's going to be bumpy, because I think this is going to be a very close, nail-biting election, but election officials across the country are ready. And by the way, we're all election geeks, so we really welcome technical questions, but I thought I'd keep it kind of at a high level. So there you go.
That's wonderful. And so I think, it's funny, like all of a sudden the audience went very quiet when you started talking about all of the skill sets that you've had to add over the years, that the job just keeps getting bigger. And certainly the panel that I moderated this morning, we had the same point. Like the job keeps getting bigger, voter education, all these technology issues, but the budget generally, unless you're LA County apparently, doesn't get bigger. So that horrible situation that people find themselves in. And it's also shocking, I think, for most years in this room to hear you say, these elections officials are ready. They have a resilience plan. They're ready for what's coming. Because I think, I don't want to speak on behalf of anybody, but I don't think a lot of people feel ready for their elections these days. So Carolina, in that kind of framing, I'm curious, first of all, could you introduce yourself, what PLEJ does? But also we were talking before the panel about this question of like collaboration between states and also at the county level. And how does that work? Like, what does that look like?
So Carolina Lopez, Executive Director at the Partnership for Large Election Jurisdictions. And all that really is, it's a nonpartisan nonprofit where the LA counties of the world, the large jurisdictions across the country, who usually serve as the leadership in their state because quite frankly, they run the most complex election operations. Biggest budgets, biggest number of voters, biggest number of polling places, everything is just bigger. And what we do is we just try to create a safe space, nonpartisan safe space for individuals to share how to process voters quicker, how to respond to the media quicker. And so I heard you say resilience, and one of the things that I've noticed, particularly this weekend, look, there's no such thing as a perfect election. How many of you actually have had a perfect election in your states? Right? Like there is no such thing. What we do is we manage chaos. We prepare for planned emergencies. We figure out what the best contingency plans are, whether it's a global pandemic or power failure or, the machine locks at the worst time, right? And what these individuals do in a moment where they have not slept in 49 days straight, where they had to replace 20% of the poll workers that didn't show up that morning, but you never knew it because we opened the doors on time. These individuals are the only ones that are not allowed to fall apart, right? You can't say anything wrong to the media, but you have to reply. You have to continue operations. You have to secure the building. You have to secure your ballots. You have to secure your people. And you also, in addition to being the chief logistics officer, the chief marketing officer, you're also the therapist in the office, trying to have people not to quit in the middle of the day, right? So it's a big role, it's a gratifying role, because once it's said and done, the fact that we are still involved in elections in this panel, even after we have moved on past that elections office, tells you that there's a bug, you get the elections bug, it is a career, it is a calling, it is service beyond self. And we still have so much to share and give, right? So that's what Pledge does. We create a community, not just within Pledge, but with fine organizations who, like Election Center, by the way, not because they're here, but the reason I was able to develop my organization was because of a class that I took there, and the relationships and the mentorship that I got, right? And the reason why we can figure out how we're gonna develop really good policies to tweak whatever we saw this year is because of our relationships with BPC, Bipartisan Policy Center. They're doing really great work to do workforce development. How do you keep these really good people who are still interested, despite 2020, that still want to work in this industry? How do we keep them engaged, and how do we build that next generation, right? So that's what we do. At Pledge, we try to work with all these different amazing groups and try to blend civil society with government and really make sure that there's good interagency collaboration. You're gonna hear tabletop exercises. God, did we do tabletop exercises in the last 4 years? And those are just different scenario plannings. There used to be a time that you used to prepare for what if a dynamite stick ends up on your Dropbox? And yet last Monday in Oregon and Washington, somebody detonated a device that damaged ballots. But the real story is not that that happened or that they caught the person. I think that the real story is how quickly our election officials opened up, ran to the media, told you what was happening, found a solution, notified the impacted voters, and helped them access their ballot. And so that's really that's really it, you know. In elections, these people are, I'm gonna say it, they're underpaid, they're under-resourced, they wouldn't do anything else. This is their life calling. And so what we're doing is trying to figure out who's doing something different, who's doing something new. In elections, we don't steal, but we copy and paste. So if you have a great template, can I possibly use it in my jurisdiction? You figured out something. One perfect example is poll worker recruitment, right? You put this wonderful plan and your senior leadership team can recite it from memory. But at the end, your reputation is only as good as the last election that you did. And it's based on tens of thousands of people that you're hoping for them to actually do the thing that you've trained them to do, right? So one state, and they're not a large jurisdiction, but they were really smart in that they figured out how to do a poll worker draft to fill about half their polling place slots. In Palm Beach County, Florida, they figured out, early voting can be a little daunting. And if I'm a mom, or I'm a first responder, or I'm an essential worker that I work overnight, I may not be able to stand in line for 2-3 hours to go vote. So they introduced an appointment system where you could be in and out in 15 minutes. That's the kind of ingenuity that we try to implement. Like, what are you doing that I can replicate in my community, and vice versa? So that's Pledge.
That's wonderful. And in case you missed it, that was an election technology story as well. Just to say human-centered design, which we all talk about, but also that application that's required and making sure that people know about it and that it's intuitive and works and that it's connected to whatever other systems it needs to be connected to. So there's a lot of this question of like, how do we build communities of practice across states in this case, or in this larger community across international lines in order to share these practices, share this code, and build this sort of resiliency and ability to share lessons and even incidents really, really quickly. Thank you for sharing that. So Tammy, I know you have a deck, and I think you're going to take us through kind of some of the specific changes that we've seen over the years.
Yeah, I have a couple of slides I wanted to share with you all to get us started and give you some visuals around setting the stage for election technology in 2024. I know many of you are going to be going out to the polls tomorrow. You might be visiting some central tabulation centers and some other locations. So give you a little bit of a flavor. You'll see some of the jurisdictions that many of you might be visiting, as well as some others all across the country. The National Association of Election Officials is often referred to as Election Center. We have members, about 1,900 members in almost every state and some of the territories. And what I wanted to share with you today is a little bit of a little bit of a history lesson on the way in which voters in the United States of America have changed the method in voting and how those changes have created some additional technological needs. What we're looking at here is one of my favorite graphs. How many of you have a favorite graph or chart that you like to refer to? You'll see why. This is my favorite in a moment. I hear some chuckles, so I know there are some geeks out there. This is from Charles Stewart at MIT, and what we're looking at the top are American voters who voted on election day. On one of the lower sides, I'm always bad with my stage left and my stage right, so you'll look and see on one side it's voters who voted by mail, and the other it's voters who voted early, and this is 1996. So let's look at 2000, when voters started getting more options, and you'll notice a little snow globe that pops up. This is 2004, 2008, 2016. As voters are given options in voting, they're falling away from going to the polls on Tuesday, on election day only. So what happened in 2020? Well, of course, we had a huge distribution to early voting, both in person and by mail during the pandemic. But you'll notice there are some states still at the top, and that's because they did not allow their voters to have those options even in a global pandemic. So all of these methods required some technological adjustments. Basically, our election officials run 3 elections at once. They run by mail, because everyone has voters who vote by mail. They're either military and overseas voters, voters with disabilities. They are running an early in-person voting in some regard. It might even just be replacement ballots. And then they're preparing for Election Day. So 2022 had a little bit of a trampoline effect where it bounced back up a little bit. And the reason is because many states revoked some of those options for voters that they gave them in 2020. So the real question is, what's going on in 2024? We don't have all the results yet, but we know that in-person and voting by mail have continued to be very strong this election cycle. So these changes really impact everything from security to results reporting. When you are in your tours tomorrow, you'll notice all sorts of security protocols and measures. Some of them very very obvious with chain link fencing and not technological at all. But others that very much rely on technological logistics and solutions. And this is something that's been, in addition to all the ways in which Kim mentioned that the profession has evolved, we also know that transparency is paramount in this moment. But we can't be so transparent that we give away some of our vulnerabilities, or that we are so transparent that in fact people take what they see out of context and weaponize it. How many of you heard about the suitcases coming out from under the table in Georgia? Standard operating procedure, right? They were just ballot transport vessels. So we know that being transparent can both be beneficial but also can have some challenges. There's technological solutions that really, we mentioned Los Angeles, and here's both Los Angeles County, very large, and Ada County, Idaho. Very, not quite the large jurisdiction that Los Angeles is, but everyone is trying to leverage the technological capture of information to better serve their voters. In the United States, we say that we want our elections to be fast, cheap, and accurate, but you only get to pick 2. Now,
I think you just hurt the audience with that.
I know, right? You get to pick 2, and I will tell you that most places want it cheap and accurate, and they're very upset when it isn't fast. And so this ties into the projection of the winner tomorrow night. So what makes it faster but keeps that accuracy? Because I don't think any of us are willing to give up on accuracy. This is Montgomery County, Maryland. Some of you will be going there tomorrow. This is the way a lot of processes happen in the United States. It's 2 different people from 2 different party affiliations, manually opening up and tallying things, processing things. Other places, they have machines that can scan ballots in, can capture images, that sort of thing. So there's ways in which technology can really be useful. As you go tomorrow, it's also interesting, I think, to note, while even within a single state, you can have variation from one office to another, one county to another, one city to another. And those are, as was mentioned, a very big difference in resources. And to Carolina's point, I often talk about as well about our election officials being under-resourced, understaffed, and lately, let's be honest, they've been under attack. And those attacks can come from within, but they can also be amplified by foreign adversaries who want nothing more than free and fair elections to no longer be something that happens globally. So I know you're all familiar with that. And what I would like to do now is I think that's my last slide. So turn it back for the conversation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I think we've just had like almost like zoomed up from the individual civil servant, election practitioner, all the new things they're having to learn and do and be without a whole lot of support, to peer support networks, and then back down to what does this actually look like on the ground, and kind of what is the national picture of election technology. I guess one of the things that was really striking to me the last election cycle was you had CISA out there saying this was the most secure election in American history. I'm curious actually just for quick reactions, maybe from the three of you, if you don't mind. Like, that's a wild thing to say, especially for people who are in a political position, because it might come to light later that there was a hack and you just didn't know about it. How did you feel about that statement, or what made that statement true, or what made it not true?
So when that statement was made, it was right before Election Day, and to say that it was tense across the country in election offices would be an understatement, because we had the President of the United States attacking our election system. I got to ask many times to talk about vote-by-mail elections when I would get called by national reporters saying, you know, the president just said this silly thing. What do you say, Secretary Wyman? And then I would have to try to walk that election administrator, nonpartisan, even though I was a Republican elected official, line. And so by the time we got to this point in the election where they released this letter, this was election officials who were sitting on the GCC, right, the Government Coordinating Council. So this was groups of election officials from across the country and professionals who were advising the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, on their role working with election officials. And there was a level of frustration that I think everyone shared, and so they thought it would be a good idea to try to inspire confidence to send a letter where all of them signed it, and one of them was my election director, and they all signed it and said, this is the most secure election in the country's history. And the reason we believed it is because we knew what we were seeing, CISA was seeing, what Microsoft was seeing at their cybersecurity center, what all of the people who had any kind of insight into technology were seeing at a global level. They knew that our system was holding, and that we had built a system that was working. And unfortunately, the Iranian actors thought it would be a good idea to create a website called Enemies of the People, and it targeted the people who signed that letter. And if that was, and it was targeted with death threats. It was great. Yeah, that was great. And then, as you can see, that you just sometimes have to try to lighten up the room because it becomes pretty heavy pretty quickly. And so then the president, immediately jumped on it, and it became the director of CISA signed on the letter to Chris Krebs, who was later fired by tweet. I think that's one of his claims to fame. But I say all this because at the time it was frustration by election officials that you're attacking a system that is working better than it has ever worked before. We have never been this unified. We have never had this level of communication. We have never been able to do the things we've done in a global pandemic. And you're saying that it's not secure.
I'd like to dive a little deeper for either of you, whichever one feels inspired by this question. But I mean, there was something really important embedded in what you just said, which is the reason we felt confident in that was because of what CISA, part of the Department of Homeland Security, what Microsoft was seeing. There's like a ... there, there's an ellipse there, which is, and that you knew as practitioners that the elections commissioners of the United States at the state level knew what those organizations were seeing, threat intelligence. So I'm curious if one of you could speak to that, because that was a lot of work to build the ability to receive that threat intelligence and have an informed perspective.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things to know about both 2020 but also this election is that election professionals in the United States at all levels of government have been working together to make sure that they can identify when there are the attacks are forthcoming, right? So they're able to identify when someone is trying to breach their systems and whether or not they've had sufficient protections. And up until this date, knock on wood, we've had sufficient abilities to reject almost every attack. But also to know that they have a network to inform each other around what the attacks look like, what the policies were, the practices were, so that they could protect against them. And in the places where there were some breaches, to make sure that there wasn't actually a change in any of the systems. There wasn't a change in the voter registration systems that they were able to breach, and that was a couple of places. So we know that we can recover if there is a breach. And that's what is so critical, is that in that moment, state and local election officials and the federal government really did come together in a global pandemic, and we saw more American citizens voting than in any other election in United States history. In a global pandemic, under attack by foreign adversaries. But you all know that it's very difficult to breach your election systems. It's very difficult to hack your systems or switch out votes. But what is really easy? Propaganda and campaigns. It's so easy to say that you've breached the system, to say that you've hacked the system, to create, particularly with the use of AI, all sorts of visuals that make it seem like something has happened, and to spread that narrative widely through both your own country's networks, but others. So it's far easier for anyone to have that kind of an attack. And that's why, as Kim mentioned, it's so important that we have the communication tools to be able to debunk these things in advance. But what we are seeing here in the United States, and I imagine you probably have some similar experiences potentially in your own countries, is that there is a portion of our electorate, a portion of our society that will not believe the truth, that will not believe the facts, and only will believe if their person or their party wins, full stop. So into that new normal, how do we, in fact, make sure that our democracies remain vibrant and free and fair? And I think what we're seeing in this moment in the United States is to make sure that those who do believe in the truth, that do believe that our courts need to uphold the results, that they stand up, and no matter what party they are, and say, you know what, my person lost, but I believe in this system. And I should say there's an asterisk there, that we have to make sure that things are fully audited. We want to make sure that there really wasn't some sort of a problem, right? So it's only when we are able to audit and to make sure that if there is evidence of something that was criminal or something that, in fact, through the election, that we take it to the courts, that the courts decide, and that we have processes in place to make sure that the rule of law is maintained.
Well said. And I want to note, we had like a brief moment where this was an optimistic panel, and now we've taken a turn. I noticed it also happened when you said the letters A and I in close succession. Carolina, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about AI. Could you talk maybe a little bit about deepfakes and all the bad stuff? But I also know there's a lot of really exciting innovation happening for positive applications of generative AI.
So I will say in full disclosure that I'm a big fan of figuring out ways to make our election officials work a little faster, smarter, with more analysis. And I think artificial intelligence has allowed that. So a story told in two parts. On the misinformation piece, Los Angeles County, California, they are the largest elections office in the country, not just in the number of voters, but I mean, their footprint. Like, it takes forever to go from one end of the county to the other. So last year, there was a report on social media that there was a Dropbox on fire. And it took about 90 minutes for someone from the elections office to drive to said Dropbox. Traffic is also a factor in the story. And during those 90 minutes, it was on every news channel at noon. When the elections staff got there, they immediately asked, did you guys give me the right address? I don't think I'm at the right place. And they're like, nope, that's where it is. And he was like, there's no fire. In fact, I'll take a picture and I'll pick up the ballots while I'm here. It ended up being somebody who was really creative with Photoshop. And they had taken a picture of the Dropbox and they had hyperimposed a fire. And during those 90 minutes, of course, everybody was very, very concerned. And to LA County's detriment, the weekend after, the news was all about, but what if it had been on fire? Instead of, please turn your ballot, do not wait till the last minute. If you don't feel comfortable dropping at a drop box, here's some other places where you can drop them off, right? So on that side, certainly, my 15-year-old niece on Canva can, develop some really great imagery as well as some artificial intelligence or ChatGPT, right? I choose to lean into the positive. Denver, Colorado, which is a large jurisdiction in a really progressive state. And when I say progressive, I mean like legislative access, not political access. They are using something that allows you to automatically translate what I'm saying into 83 languages, real time. And they have compared it side by side with Google Translate. And it is better because it's less regional. So how many of you speak Spanish out of curiosity? Okay, if you speak Spanish, you might just nod if I say that Mexican Spanish is different than Cuban Spanish, which is different than South American Spanish, right? Like one word could mean one thing, and I could be insulting you in a different country, and I did not mean to do that, right? And so this particular device takes a more conservative approach to the translation, and it's been so helpful that now other types of government agencies are using this device, which, by the way, costs $399. So now, just a number of other non-elections offices have found a use to do that. Broward County, Florida, the second largest county in Florida, not hanging chads, but also same state, they've built 2 bots. One bot is to talk to the voters. How many of you offer your office hours 24/7? Mm-hmm. Evening hours? Weekend hours? You're not alone. Our elections officials typically try to keep 8 to 5, at least for the public. But infusing artificial intelligence means that now you could be available when the voter has questions, right? And you get to define what the questions are and what the answers are, unlike if you Google, God knows what they're going to find, right? Okay. This office has also introduced a similar bot for their poll workers. Because if they're like me, you have early Alzheimer's and you just forget what I learned 2 weeks ago. So that's just like one of the many ways that they're leaning into artificial intelligence and technology to make the process cleaner, faster, better, and hopefully to fight some of that mis and disinfo.
Thank you. It's really helpful, and I know there's a lot of innovation happening across many of the elections management bodies that are represented in the room. I think there's also a lot of strange vendors of AI floating around out there, so it's always good to think forward-leaning like you're talking about, but buyer beware in terms of the technology itself. So I wanted to very quickly, we have just a few minutes. First of all, I wanted to pass along one thing from the questions. It's actually not a question. Where did it go? They said, just a note of appreciation, and I think this is worth calling out because it's, again, for everyone in the room. Service beyond self. I'll forget which one of you said this. Service beyond self. What an excellent description of this incredibly difficult job that election managers have and that contributes to the very heart of democracy. But one final question, and there's actually 2 different versions of this in the chat here. One says, how can voting machines be used to strengthen trust in elections? And the second one says, what is the role of elections technology in helping or harming trust in elections?
I'll jump in really quickly, and that is, so I was an election official in a little place called Maricopa County, Arizona. You might have heard of it. And I only want my vote to be counted by a machine. And the reason I say that is I oversaw hand count audits where human beings counted the ballots to make sure that the machine was accurate. And when we first started doing it in 2006, we had the human beings count the ballots into stacks of 25. Human beings cannot consistently count to 25. So we changed it to 10, piles of 10. And I would have a room this big, and in every single table, over the course of the 3 or 4 days it took to hand count, I would go to a table and I would find their stack of 9. or their stack of 11, or their stack of 14 one time. And that was after they'd counted them 3 times with 3 people watching. So I think if we can just have everybody watch a hand count audit or participate in a hand count, they will only want their ballots to be counted by a machine, because human beings cannot do repetitive tasks accurately and consistently over long periods of time.
Especially not at midnight or 2 a.m.
Not after months and months of overtime and long hours when you're exhausted.
Who wants to make the opposite case? What are the problems with trust and technology, or where does it fall short?
I mean, can I just add that in some states you have equipment, but you also have paper ballots. Some states have put, like Ada County, they've actually put the ballot images online, so that if you wanted to do your own little audit and start counting in batches of 10 or 14, you could do that from your PJs, in your PJs at home, right? And so because there is a need for greater transparency, I've also seen a shift into leaning into having camera feeds at elections offices and the tabulation rooms when they're canvassing ballots, right? So that's another level of security.
It's another level of security. Okay, so we have just a minute and a half left. So it's lightning round. Any final closing thoughts for us? Kim, would you like to go first?
I think what we've learned over the last 8 years is the environment has changed dramatically in the United States. And I know it's a lot of gloom and doom, and I can tell you that I had to go to the chiropractor yesterday because of my stress level. But with that said, it's also sharpened the people who are out doing the work. And I mean it to my core when I say what I've seen across the country is that election officials have been preparing and thinking about inspiring confidence in every way that they can. And they're doing it, I think we're now up to 97% of the ballots that will be cast in this upcoming election will be cast on a piece of paper. So, and 4 years ago, in all of the battleground states, there were paper ballots to go back and hand count, and all the states did. Some of the states counted them multiple times, and the results didn't change. It's a new environment with social media and with the foreign malign influence. But with all that said, it does sharpen election officials, and as you heard from this panel, the commitment, and I bet each and every one of you shares this, and this is something we all have in common. The work is too important, and we believe in democracy to our core, and we are the stewards of making sure that every eligible person has the opportunity to register, cast their ballot, and have it counted accurately. And I think that's what unites all of us, and thank you for being here. Thank you for the work you do in your countries, and keep talking to each other. And the more we can unite and have these types of gatherings and exchange of ideas, the better we're all going to be.
And just what an opportune time to have this. Today in America, we're celebrating National Election Hero Day. So from our families to yours, happy Election Hero Day. Thanks for being with us.
And